Welcome. Hello to everyone. My name is Dr. Eliana Ramirez. It is my great joy and honor to be here tonight with Dr. Rupi Legha. Dr. Legha, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
I have been looking forward to this conversation for several weeks now. I am just like all heart emojis because the work that you're doing is so important. It is pushing boundaries and it's saving lives. I felt that in my throat as I was just saying it because it is so important what you're doing. As we're about to jump into it, I just also want to welcome everyone who's logging in here. And for folks who watch this recording after the fact, we are going to have intense conversation. We are going to steer away from details that are about trauma that can be activating for folks. But we do want to just acknowledge that whenever we talk about mental health crises, it can activate people. And if at any point folks are feeling like they need some help to quickly settle their nervous systems or thoughts start racing or what have you, there are a couple of very quick fixes that or strategies that we can use. So I want to just share two of them with everyone here. The first is to take a bag of frozen peas or anything really cold and put it on the back of the neck. That can activate the vagus nerve to very quickly settle the body and the mind. Another thing that's really helpful are taking deep breaths and a slower, longer exhalation than inhalation. Doing that repeatedly can help to really kind of take down the temperature if we start to feel really activated. And then the third thing, which you might see me doing quite a bit, is rocking side to side or front to back. Again, it activates that vagus nerve and it reminds the body of what it was like when we were in utero, which for many people creates a sense of calming sensation. So with that, I also just want to invite people to introduce yourselves in the chat. We'd love to know who's here. Please, throughout this hour together, if you have questions, put them in the chat and we'll get to them as best we can. So with that, Dr. Legha, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your article?
Of course. My name is Rupi Legha. I am the daughter of Sewa and Kuldeep. I am a dog mom to two unruly dachshunds named Sachi and Saint, aka Versace and Yves Saint Laurent. I am an auntie to a treasured nibbling. And let's see. At my essence, I am pink. I am funny, and I am fashionable. And let's see, in my professional life, by training, I am a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist, an adult psychiatrist, also with some sustained experience with global mental health. And I currently have a private practice serving different parts of the United States, California, Colorado, New York, New Jersey, and New Mexico. And I recently launched an antiracism in mental health fellowship for healthcare providers to look at racism and transform the way that we practice clinically. And if I were to sum up my professional mission, it would be to change everything about healthcare and to change everything about mental health care.
Wow. Okay. So a woman with a mission and a mind and a heart, unlike any that I've ever witnessed with psychiatrists. And I've worked with several psychiatrists in different healthcare systems. I would introduce you as the dream psychiatrist that every social worker, nurse, psychologist wants to work with, because the way that you engage patients is heart first. And it's also driven by science, but it's driven by relationships and the sense of safety that all of us need. I cannot tell you enough how much I respect you. And I'm so grateful that you'd be willing to do this conversation, because I want for everyone on LinkedIn to learn about you, because you really are moving the needle at a time when we need these conversations, as mental health distress is really just going off the charts with youth, with adults. And so this conversation about rethinking our crisis care system is extremely timely. Just want to welcome Dr. Daniels. Hey, Dr. Daniels, I'm so grateful that you're here from Atlanta, and we've got more folks. Please log in and say hello and let us know where you're from. Dr. Legha, would you tell us a little bit about this article that was just published?
Yes. So I wrote a paper in PLOS Mental Health called Reconsidering Calling 911. Is it time to set a new standard for mental health crisis response? And, just listening to you speak just now, Eliana, I was thinking about what an important moment mental health care is having in our national consciousness. I don't know all the details, but I believe the Surgeon General put out a post today about parents and parenting and the crisis facing them related to worry about their children. And so the pressures parents are facing. I was recently part of a special journal issue looking at the pediatric mental health crisis, post-COVID in particular. And so, there are all these fires that are going off, and we can look at them in so many different ways. Yet another one is just the stories in the news of people calling 911 for help, and then the police arrive and people are tragically shot and killed. What if all of these things were signaling for us that the ways that we're doing things are not working and that we need to drastically rethink them? Not do a training, not that those things aren't without merit and value, and not try to get more of what we've got to more people, but really had to say, what, if this many fires are there, it's an all-out conflagration, and what do we start to do differently? And I think that was the spirit in which I wrote this paper, really trying to answer the call related to Sonia Massey and Ryan Gaynor and Wiz Rosario and Yang Yang, and trying to imagine what a different approach would look like if people had something better than the standard. If you're having a psychiatric emergency, if you're having an emergency, hang up and call 911 or go to your closest emergency room. What does it look like to think of another way? And then what are the tools that we can put in the hands of healthcare providers and people in the community so they have something that they can do differently immediately to protect themselves and protect the community as much as possible?
Ooh. I'm hearing this and thinking about it as a social worker who was trained to tell people call 911 and go to the emergency room. So just off the bat that you're saying that we might want to rethink that is like, well, with what? It's terrifying for a lot of clinicians who are working with clients that are having suicidal ideation to even imagine something different. So this is why I feel like you really are the dream psychiatrist that all of us want to work around, because you have the courage to imagine differently. And then the spunk, the chutzpah, what we want to call it, to go ahead and put it out there in writing. It's huge to be somebody who is running against the grain like that. But your call, this clarion call, could not be more needed. And so I wonder if you can kind of talk to us a little bit about, well, what does this even mean to rethink this entire system?
Yeah, so I think there are many different ways that we can think about this. And one concept that comes up in the paper that I think is relevant for our discussion here relates to giving people the full truth about what things really are. And it's a term, the term that I use is called the full informed consent. And the idea behind that is that the usual risk benefit analysis that a healthcare provider provides, it really just, it's the tip of the iceberg. There's so much beneath the surface that's not addressed, particularly in relation to racism, other systems of oppression, and the harms baked into our very standard practices. So in terms of thinking about calling 911 or going to an emergency room for a mental health emergency, instead of giving that standard and even dismissive statement, what does it look like to have some nuance and say, okay, let's look at this option. This is your standard recommendation to do this, but I want us to think through some of the things that come with it that often are not brought up in a usual risk benefit analysis. this full informed consent approach is evidence informed or evidence based, if you will. We know that racially minoritized people, and Black people in particular, are more likely to be restrained in emergency room settings. We know there's a greater likelihood of forced hospitalizations among Black people as well. So there are all these inequities at play here related to crisis care management. And even though they're established and have been around, researched and documented, never mind the lived experience that's been around for even longer, even though these things are out there, the standard recommendations are not anti-racist or anti-oppressive in nature. They're not giving the full truth. So I think that's one big idea, is what does it look like to give people the full truth of things? And related to that, the news is often left out of the clinical encounter. And so, when Sonia Massey's, final moments were all over the media, why is that not brought into clinical decision making in terms of how we're talking to people and trying to make sense of things with them? To me, it feels very, very important to tell her story, to tell the story of Daniel Prude, and to bring that into decision making with people and families and communities.
For people who are not familiar with their names, would you mind sharing just a little bit about their experiences?
Yeah, and I'll say in advance, I hope to honor things accurately. If I might get a couple of details wrong, but no, I do not mean any disrespect. Daniel Prude died in 2020. I believe it was in March of 2020. He was experiencing a mental health emergency, and he initially went to a local emergency room where he was evaluated and treated and discharged. And his brother, Mr. Joe Prude, eventually said, we reported that there had been recent suicide attempts related to trying to jump in front of a train, throwing oneself down a flight of stairs, but he was deemed safe for discharge. And when Daniel Prude was discharged, later that night was still in crisis. And according to the news accounts, it sounds like he may have been psychotic in that moment. His family called 911 for help, feeling like they had not, the situation had not stabilized earlier. And then the police came, and when the police came, they put a spit mask over Daniel Prude's face, and he later died from the resulting asphyxiation. And so his story garnered more attention in the news towards the end of 2020. There now is legislation in place that bears his name that I think is coming up in New York, attempting to change some of these practices. And then Sonia Massey is a woman who called 911 for help. I forget which state she was in, but she called 911 for help. 2 police officers arrived, and one of her final words was, in the name of Jesus, I rebuke you. And the police officer shot her in the face, and she died. And it turns out her mother had called 911 the day before saying, if my daughter calls, do not send combative police, I believe is the language that she used.
Yeah, and I'm just kind of letting that settle a little bit, and kind of holding what you're sharing with reverence for their lives, and also rage that these were 2 human beings who deserve to have compassionate care, and instead received the most horrifying reaction that they could have in that moment. It was, and unfortunately, as social media is helping us to understand, more common than probably most of us want to imagine. And so for people who are not raised with melanin, right, for white people, and for people who are passing as white, may not understand the abject fear that can come up when needing to call 911 or even 988, the new crisis line for the nation, which has a 4-fold increase of, according to Wipond in this recent article, 4-fold increase of police being involved than even the lifeline, the crisis line that 988 replaces. So So I wonder just if, when you hear these stories as a psychiatrist, as an anti-racist psychiatrist in specific, what were the missed opportunities for humane treatment? What, if you could have had a magic wand and changed the situation, what would you have seen instead?
Absolutely. So many things. I think something that may not be so obvious or jump out from a biomedical perspective is the wish for help. So I'm thinking of a family that's been in touch, that I've been connected to this past week, with a family member in crisis. And it's a melanated family that is well aware of the risks of calling the police. And yet, out of desperation, family members are calling the police. And, if I think about the repeat calls to 911, it's, it's not even a desperate plea, but it's a very healthy insistence that when I'm having an emergency, you stop and you help me. And I think sometimes, even when people know the reality of what can happen, the wish and insistence is so strong that people call 911. So I think there is still this wish for safety when calling 911 and when involving the police, especially when there's a question of somebody becoming violent, which is, it's always the thing that comes up. What if the person gets violent? This person has been violent. Sonia Massey was standing around in her bathrobe with two armed police officers, and she was perceived as being potentially violent. And so, I think something that really comes up is this wish for help and understanding. I can sense that in the story of Daniel Prude with his family members who are looking for help. And then I think about that with Sonia Massey and her mother's call the day before and her own. And so I wish they had someone to call. I wish they deserve to have something better to call. And I think that's what I'm connecting to the family that I got connected to, is in this moment where I'm 3 degrees of separation away, in a non-saviorist way, I feel so strongly, why don't we have someone to show up for you? Because I have some sort of idea of what I might try to do differently, which may or may not change things. I don't know. But I have no one to recommend for you, because we're not trained to address these factors. All of these missed opportunities are not the things that we're thinking about, or that we're being trained to question and innovate.
Mm-hmm. When I hear you talking about this, and I know a little bit about your community practice, which is amazing, that you are the provider who will be with people so that they can stay out of the hospital, so that they can get through that psychiatric emergency and settle in a safe way in the community. I really, really want to clone you, because we deserve to have people like you across all communities. And I wonder if now might be a good time to bring up your slides, the presentation about your article. Okay, so we'll bring this up, and it should be available. And so for the audience, this is a shift. Typically, it's a conversation the whole time. And I saw Dr. Legha's presentation recently, and it was so phenomenal. It was like, oh my gosh, let's bring this in here. So please take it away.
All right, and Eliana, you'll stay in conversation with me to keep this peppy. All right. I would love to stay connected to folks on social media. I've been floored by how much community can be established through places like LinkedIn, X, and Instagram. And, Eliana, you're a testament to the LinkedIn community bringing people together. So please follow a message, get in touch. I want to issue a disclaimer here. And, the disclaimer is, it's so problematic in and of itself that I have to say that the standard recommendation, if you are having an emergency, is to call 911 or go to your closest emergency room. And we're talking about a paper that refutes that. But suffice it to say that this is an educational, communal gathering today, and it's no proxy or substitute for direct medical advice. A little bit about me, and please forgive some of the formatting challenges, I think, in the transfer. I might have had some blips. Guess what? We're human and we're gonna rock it anyway. I said a little bit about myself. I'm based in Los Angeles, and I spent 3 years doing global mental health, primarily in Haiti and also in Peru. And I think through some of our conversations early on, it became clearer to me how much that experience really has shaped my practices when it comes to crisis management. So this question of why did I write this paper? We started to talk about some of this. I think I laid bare my hope and goal, my imperative to try to change everything about healthcare and mental health care. So that, I would say, is the summary of my professional purpose. And my clinical practice and my anti-racism fellowship are two of the main vehicles for that. I also do a lot of writing and love to do dialogue opportunities like this one. And some of the topics that I care about relate to anti-racist medical education, medical training and professionalization, mental health training and professionalization, anti-racist clinical approaches, and physician suicide and physician well-being. And I feel like there are threads of all of these topics in this paper and in my dedication to this issue. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about why I wrote this paper from the vantage point of policing, carcerality, and crisis management, touching on a couple of key touch points from my professional life. So policing, carcerality, and crisis management. We'll look at medical training. So I finished medical school in 2009. I look so bright-eyed. And I did postgraduate training until through 2018. So 9 years of it. And during that time, if I think about my exposure to policing, carcerality, and crisis management, I don't think the concept of policing or the carceral state, I don't think that ever came up in my training, in any of my didactic training. It just was not something that I was ever taught to think about in terms of the interfaces between mental health and the carceral state. And these gaps that appear in different portions of my professional life, I think the paper and other ongoing efforts are my very best attempt to try to fill and address them, because I think it's so crucial. And this says Racial Reckoning 2020. This was another big touch point. You'll see here an image of people honoring and defying the death of Daniel Prude, sitting on the steps of the Rochester, New York City Hall in homage to Daniel Prude's passing, with the spit mask over their faces. And the way that this was showing up for me in 2020 is I was working in mental health facility in the emergency room, the psych emergency room. And I was also in an outpatient clinic. And I remember people being in crisis in the midst of George Floyd's lynching and the uprisings that were taking place. And as I was working with people in crisis, I found myself warning them of all the risks of going into the emergency room setting where I was getting paid to work. And, as that started to happen over and over and over and over again, I could no longer sit with being a part of providing care in these settings and not coming to terms with the harm that I was perpetuating myself. And again, policing, carcerality, and crisis management, it was status quo as usual, even though it was 2020, if you're having an emergency, send people to the emergency room, and no regard for the mistreatment and harm and trauma that can take place in those settings. And then the fellowship launched in 2024. I have a butterfly there, but this was really, my attempt to try to change everything and present it in a way that has meaning and logic behind it, and tries to establish a common lexicon, a shared language, so we can actually participate in meaningful conversations, bearing in mind that during the training people aren't, period, providers are not getting the kind of knowledge and information that they need to think about how to keep people safe at home so that they don't have to interface with the police or 911 or the emergency room. And then my global mental health experience, as I referenced, particularly being in Haiti for 2.5 years, when you think about Haiti, the perceptions that people have in our country are so distorted. My experience of Haiti was just how rich and vast the country's culture and history are, and by far the richest resources that I was working with in those settings related to communities and families and community health workers. And because of the lack of the more bureaucratized mental health structures, the best care often stood to be provided locally and at home. And so I had no choice but to think about how to do that, often with pretty urgent situations. And the ways that I had been trained in the United States really had very little to do with the reality of what was before me. So this paper, a brief review of it, it talks a bit about the existing standards for mental health crisis response. And, I think there are some people out there that are starting to talk a little bit about policing, but certainly not enough. And it goes into some of my own lived experience, having survived elements of this crisis response system over 20 years ago. Certainly my lived experience, and really the very deep wounds that I suffered from experiencing mental health crisis management, and then operating in a very ableist profession that really forced me to feel great shame about it. It took me so long to recover from that, if I have entirely, that I cannot imagine doing that to other people. And then the full informed consent we started to talk about a little bit. And the think, reflect, act paradigm is borrowed from the fellowship. I think many people are talking about things this way, that, we've got to have knowledge gaps filled. We have to have a self-reflective practice as mental health providers. And then we have to get really clear on what the action is. And the paper itself gets into some clear anti-racist action steps that healthcare providers can engage in, and also that families can engage in as well to keep themselves safe. So let's see here. Some of the existing approaches relate to 911, going to an emergency room, the police being the default responders for mental health crises, and then the litany of humiliations and abuses in emergency room and inpatient settings. I know a lot of people will cite mobile crisis, or I think when we think of alternatives to 911, the examples that are upheld are 988, as you mentioned, Eliana, and then mobile crisis. And while, again, not without merit, they don't tell the complete story. To your point, citing Rob Weipland's work or educational messages about how oftentimes 988 results in the police being involved. And then, even when people make it into the ER inpatient facility, those spaces are traumatic as well. So the alternatives really don't provide more loving and humane options. They often recapitulate or maybe delay by a bit the usual business that causes so much harm. And at least not even at least, but from what I've seen, and also what some research shows us, restraints are misused and abused as options of convenience very quickly. And then I think, we call it mental health care, but there is so much trauma baked into it related to the coercion, the force, the over-pathologizing of things, the othering. So yes, the existing approaches are completely insufficient. And for those reasons, I feel strongly that I cannot do to others the things that I would not want done to myself, while also reckoning with the fact that I have as part of my career and as part of my training. So we talked about the full informed consent, getting beyond the tip of the iceberg and confronting the unstated risks baked into mental health care, going beyond the typical risk-benefit analysis that's completely inadequate, and weaving in socio-political realities and an understanding of racism policing as well, giving people the existing standard, and the paper provides some verbatim language that providers can rely on, but also beginning to talk about the additional risks, including through storytelling from the news, and then preparing for additional risks. Like, let's talk about calling 911 or going to the emergency room. Let's take a look at that as a standard recommendation. But then what are some of the other things that we can look at related to peer respite centers or community action teams, or even informal organizing within neighborhoods, which I've certainly experienced here in my own home of Los Angeles, and then in Lima, Peru, and also in Haiti Central Plateau. If you'd like to learn more about the full informed consent, you can go to my website, and I have a couple of other posts about what that can look like. And then here are some examples of the Think, Reflect, Act framework for healthcare providers. So under the Think category, can we imagine what it would look like if psychiatrists, as part of their board certification or their tests that they take during residency, if you had to understand mental health care's intersection with the carceral state, what would it look like if, in addition to talking about the APA and NAMI, we also had psychiatrists talking about SIN's Invalid and the Black Emotional Mental Health Collective, and the Movement for Family Power and other organizing powerhouses in our communities? What would it look like if we were trained to give the full informed consent? What would it look like if people in psychiatry residency learned how to operate in neighborhoods and organize neighbors, or be part of their neighborhood, and have these conversations with the person to the left and to the right to think these things through? And again, I'm really thinking of real life experiences I've had here in LA, and there's great lists of local peer respite centers, and ask people, they'll tell you that they've had a wonderful experience there. These alternatives can be really healing for people. And at least what I've found is the instances in which I've managed to help people avoid 911, emergency room, and inpatient settings, not only do they seem to heal more quickly, but I think the damage that's been avoided is immeasurable. Who knows how life-saving or how many ripples this can cause. I see so many adults who had mental health care as children and are still carrying the wounds of what it did to their relationships with their parents, the way that they see themselves, and their rage and resentment towards doctors in the healthcare system for having had that done to them. And then for members of the community, when we were looking at the stories of Daniel Prude and Sonia Massey and what could have been done differently, what were the missed opportunities, I think it was storytelling about what happens to people. And I think it involves really asking people about what it feels like to be helpless during these emergencies, and what's the wish behind being able to call 911. And then I love giving people questions to ask healthcare providers and to ask doctors in particular. But what does it look like for you to walk into a care encounter and say to a psychiatrist, can you tell me what to do during a psychiatric emergency for my loved one? Can you explain the risks and benefits involved with these interventions? How do you determine whether the benefit of calling 911 and going to the emergency room outweighs the risk of further violence and trauma? Do you determine whether the benefit outweighs the risk at all? Are you even thinking about it that way? And then, what does it look like to educate neighbors about loved ones who are experiencing mental health emergencies and explain the risks of calling the police or 911? Literally going door to door, asking people what they're noticing, asking them what their fears are, what are the worst case scenarios, and then giving them other options besides calling 911. So some final thoughts. Hopefully this paper has some touch points related to transforming mental health care and psychiatric practice and setting new standards of care. The connection to physician suicide that I feel, we talk about physician suicide among healthcare providers. Eliana, you've been sharing with me about how rates are even higher in other healthcare provider categories. From what I know from being a doctor in medical training and just seeing physician suicide and depression being such a part and parcel experience of medical school and residency and beyond. I think a lot about how there are doctors who end up in crisis, and I imagine other healthcare providers as well, who feel like they have nowhere to go or no alternative than an inpatient hospitalization, which they feel will be the end of their careers. Or I think just such a source of shame and stigma and humiliation that it's unfathomable, and the resulting outcome of not having somewhere to go when in crisis can be fatal for people. And my acknowledgements, I want to thank the PLOS Mental Health team, especially editor Dr. Carly Montag Cardoso, as well as Akima Aiken-Brown for Real Families for Change. Without their support and presence, I wouldn't have written the paper. It wouldn't have been possible.
Oh, wow, Rupi. Yeah, there's so much in this that is like popcorning off in my head right now of just like gratitude and the concrete suggestions that you give for family members, for people who are experiencing distress, what to ask a provider, that we can even hold our providers accountable if they're even considering the issues of risk for the person who's seeking care. I think from the provider side, so often providers will immediately call 911 or say go to the emergency room because there's a fear that if the patient dies by suicide, then our licenses are at stake, that we might be sued. And I learned this from a person who does a lot of suicide activism, who shared that, in fact, Kelechi Oboso is her name. Kelechi had shared that, in fact, very, very few clinicians are ever sued by people's families who had died by suicide. And there are myths that clinicians tend to work with. And one of those myths is about our needing to protect ourselves, which, what a horrifying thing. We're there to help the patient, and we're thinking about how to protect ourselves rather than how to help that patient and keep that patient safe. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it has looked like when you have been with a patient and actually been able to help them stay out of the emergency room. What were the kind of concrete things that were done during that period of escalated crisis and that brings it down to a non-escalated state?
Yeah, so that's such a great question. Without dehumanizing in any way, I sense kind of like two entities. There's one where people and families have been through the 911 ER inpatient continuum, and then there's a category where they haven't. I can think of many experiences where people have been through it before, learned their lesson, so to speak, and then want nothing to do with it, in which case, how could I describe this? It comes into alignment more easily because of the experience that's preceded it. So I can think of, and I'll be thoughtful about how I share people's identities and positionality just to protect their privacy. There was one young person that I saw, and they were, maybe like late teens, and what was happening. I think most mental health providers would have looked at them and said they're manic and psychotic. Okay. And their parents didn't know what to do. And it had happened a year before, and a year before the police were called, they were taken in, they were forcefully injected and restrained. And then, they were completely rattled by it. This was a racially minoritized family. And so when it came up again, when they were connected to me, mom and dad were very clear that they did not want to go that route. And so I remember the conversation with them saying, this is the standard route, that, and I'm obligated by law to at least give you the standard, and I'm going to try to go above and beyond that because that's what you all need and deserve. And so they kind of got that was the typical approach. And then, with the police involvement, mom and dad were already clear from the community that they were in. They were very fearful that if the police picked up their child, there was a great likelihood of gun violence happening in that. So I think they were connected to the risks. And so the risk benefit for them of keeping their child at home, even though it was incredibly hard on them, they were up for it. So that seems to be one ingredient, some awareness or understanding about how the care is not caring.
Mm.
And, if people don't have that awareness, sometimes I have to walk them through it, but it can be a tough sell because the other providers involved may not be saying the same thing or may be more conflicted about it than I am because I don't work in those settings. For this family, mom was like an around the clock doctor or nurse in terms of constant supervision. So how do you shore up family resources to keep an eye on someone around the clock? And in this young person's case, their siblings had not been involved. So I remember connecting to their siblings, and they had a sibling who was very caring, was in a caregiving profession, had a very clear understanding, and I was like, oh, like let's get you on board. But there's no way that the parents could have organized the siblings, been parents to them, thought about their well-being, worried about their family. So it just helped to kind of be the magnet to kind of support each person and bring them together. I remember we did a big family meeting, and actually the child in question, showed up part of the time and other times not. But there was real family repair work that needed to be done, but it was a coming together. A lot of around the clock support of mom and being very available. So when those things come up, how do you stay available to someone more often than 1 hour appointment once a week? So certainly availability and communication. I can think of another child that I saw who was younger, and family had also been through the medical system more than a few times. And with kids, when they move in and out of the healthcare system and the emergency settings, I always worry about families getting reported to child welfare. And, healthcare providers are mandated reporters. If they have suspicion, they call it in. And certainly when I see racially minoritized kids going in and out, the likelihood is greater. And so those parents also understood the risk. And, mom in particular was up for providing around the clock care. And then, since we didn't have access to labs and regular vitals, we had to come up with solutions for that related to bringing in the pediatric healthcare provider. And so I'm rambling a bit, but those are some of the core ingredients that begin to come up. I guess like really being on the team with the family, like it really has to be tight. And I think if that's absent, the risk benefit analysis begins to shift.
Yeah, that was not at all rambling. That was outstanding. It was super helpful. The takeaway messages that I'm hearing from you are that it's always a risk benefit analysis, but that needs to happen, and it's going to be different for every individual person, family, and even neighborhood and community. What's available and what's not, and the capacity to be with somebody who is in a state of crisis, and however long it takes them to come down from that state of crisis, which may or may not involve emergency medications being administered, which may or may not involve any number of other things that can help them to settle, like being with a favorite animal or playing video games that they're really into that help them to kind of focus and get engaged, or just being around family and having their favorite foods and all pressures taken off of them, that they don't have to perform, they don't have to go to work or school, whatever it is that they need so that they can kind of settle. And I feel like the need to say that, of course, nothing that's being shared here tonight is medical advice, nor is it legal advice, obviously, that people really need to consult with a licensed clinician of their own. And I think that the way that you have written this article and that you have presented this information is to let families know that we actually have quite a bit more ability to engage in a healing capacity. And we have a right to expect that the healthcare services that we receive do not cause injury to us. So those two things in America, many people defer to doctors all the time and think that there's only one way to go. And what I'm hearing you say is that there are alternatives that can be more humanizing.
Yeah, I also that following on that wonderful synopsis, I'm thinking of other people that I'm working with and I've worked with, and this level of care progression, it can leave people feeling really tossed around. And I'm thinking of a young adult that I've worked with recently, where in the past there's absolutely been talk of inpatient, residential, and partial programs. And we're doing pretty intensive work together, pretty intensive therapy together. And there are moments when things, destabilize, and this question will come up: of should we think about other things? And what's so striking about this experience, that it's taught me, is we tend to always come back to, let's keep at it together. In my mind, I'm obligated to think of what better is out there for you. And yet when I do that, it becomes more alienating, like sort of like, well, we need to think about a higher level of care, which is not without merit. But I'm just thinking about how it can be very off-putting and alienating to someone, like as if you think I'm really unwell, there's no way I can get better, and you're starting to give up on the work that we're doing together. So I feel like that shift also comes up. With one of the children that I'm describing, Thursday, Friday, mom and dad were thinking emergency room. And not that school is any measure of success, but Monday the child went to school, and the child got themselves to school. And I something happened. In the cosmos, I don't know where this will show up for this child in the weeks, months, years, and decades to come, but it felt very important that this child was able to go to school on Monday on their own, instead of being in the emergency room or being hospitalized.
Yes, I am so appreciative that you're giving this look through the lens of families themselves and what is considered important for the family and for the patient or the client. For folks who are not familiar, emergency rooms, if someone shows up in an emergency room in suicidal crisis or any other kind of mental health crisis, depending on the patients and the ratio of patients to docs and other providers, you can end up sitting in an emergency room for more than a day in psychiatric crisis and not be transferred to a hospital. And that delay can mean sitting on a gurney or being in a hallway on a chair that's terribly uncomfortable. And if you think about an emergency room, there are emergencies that are happening all the time. So it's not an environment that lends itself to reducing the amount of stress hormones that are flooding a person's body. And of course, all of the risks of the systemic racism, systemic homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, all of the isms will come through potentially within interaction, whether it's from a provider to the patient or the way that the system itself is set up. So are there gender neutral bathrooms available? Or, is it the automatic thought that the kid or the adult needs to be in restraints because they're being too loud? And like you were saying, it's a matter of convenience, frankly, for the clinicians than it is medically necessary for the patient. But to be able to be at home, you have more control over the environment. And a favorite blanket, a favorite music or foods, these things that really do help to settle the nervous system that is not available oftentimes in emergency rooms. So you were talking a little bit about the parents being involved on Thursday and Friday, and then the young person themselves being able to go to school on Monday. That is amazing, because the sooner that the young person can get back to their regular life, the less likely, I'm guessing, the less likely it is that they're going to internalize that stigma that is so rampant in society. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I'm thinking of some of these scenarios where, I'm evaluating, but I actually, the young person is not spending that much time with me. A lot of times, I think, and I think about neurodivergence in particular and the role that will play, but the interactions with healthcare providers are so stressful and loaded. And, sometimes the message I'll give, especially to younger people, is like, you go be a kid, and parents, like your parents and I are going to get to work. Like, so we'll call you in like when we need your consultation. But so I especially the younger they get, the more I'm spending more time with family members, and just trying to send a message that we're going to work hard for you. Like the adults, like we have failed somehow, and it's time for us to get to work. So that's been fun. And if you're able to fit me in, if you can tolerate 5 minutes, of a video chat with me, we'll do that. And I mean, not to be flippant, but I'm not at all beyond sending little gifts to people, like whether they're kids or adults, because, I mean, to get through these things, what bigger life victory can there be? What harder, like, hardship can there be? Eliana, you're gonna have to get me back on track with the question. I started.
No, that was great. The question was just specifically. Oh goodness, I'm sorry, it's escaped me now. I think that it was around what it meant for the young person to be able to go back to school on Monday.
Yeah. Yes. So, with this child in particular, I had some logic in my mind, but what I really felt in my heart and my gut was that the emergency room would mean restraint and injection. I felt, I just had a very clear feeling that likelihood was very much there. And then I had a feeling that the environment, as you were explaining, would be so activating for them that the coercion would be brought in. And then I sensed from what I knew of the parents that this would, of course, be devastating for them. And then there would probably, be pushed to hospitalization. So feeling all those things coming on and really sensing the danger of that. And so I think recognizing that, and then, the strategy was to give enough space to be distressed and to start setting some supportive boundaries around things. And, and I don't mean this to be person blaming in any way, but, really trying to support the parents with figuring out what to respond to and what to ignore, which is much easier when you have a friend, right? Like whether that's me as an auntie, a sister, or, a psychiatrist. Another big thing I think was really the child sensing the we of the adults. So me, parents, other adults who are involved, like it's a we, like we're not divided on this, and anyone else sees the same way, and we're on team you. That's and then I think like for that child, like not that schoolwork is so important, but there were expectations about like what you'll have to do in a day, or what you get to do in a day. So we worked towards a brief session with me here and there. We worked in some age appropriate activities related to some schoolwork, and some social activities, and then we had rewards built in. And then I think the other really big thing was just the open dialogue with the child, and like supporting the parents with that of like, okay, here's what's happening. This is what you're sharing with us. These are the options that exist. We know they're not great options, but let's think through each one. And, the child was pretty clear that they didn't want to go. And then at some point they said, well, maybe I do. And then, parents were like, okay, we'll walk you through what that's going to look like. And then, it was okay, maybe I don't want to do this. So that's what that was like. And then if I think about another child, I mean, it's hard. Like I've had kids who are, or adults even, like maybe punching a hole in the wall because of anger. And how do you manage that? And how do you respond to that? And then also, how do you talk to parents and say, if you don't feel like you're up for this, you don't have to do this. Sometimes parents just need to know they tried everything before they went to the thing that they were trying to avoid. And so sometimes just the opportunity to try and see if it's worth it. And then knowing that they tried, what can it mean if their child does end up going to the emergency room, but the child and the parents know that they gave it their best effort to can be hugely impactful for relationships in years and decades to come in ways that I could never measure.
I'm so appreciative that you shared that. It sounds like the self-determination, both for the young person to have the ability to kind of consider multiple options, but also that the parents had the self-determination to try their best and still decide at a later point that actually this isn't doable here and we do need the kid to go somewhere else. I'm so impacted by your willingness to also share that you have lived experience and that you've seen these systems from both sides, both as a provider and somebody who had gone through them at one point. It's so important and courageous that you would share that. And that part of the reason why we were thinking about doing this LinkedIn Live is because I also experienced crisis systems as a young person. And I know that for many years, it's not something that I talked about professionally because of the stigma, and only to find out it's really, really common. It's so common among mental health providers. And I think it actually can make us better providers because we understand the systems from the other side. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your consideration for disclosing your experience as you were writing this article.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful that we are in a circle together talking about this, because yes, I will look at the camera and say this. There are many of us out there. We are here. And as far as my decision, it took so much energy to keep it to myself. And that wasn't where I started. When I was in medical school in particular, I was open. I thought, for sure, I'm going to school to become a doctor. I'm working with people who are caregivers. They, of all people, will be understanding. It was such a natural, normal, and kind of naive way of thinking about things. And so I would talk about it, and then the blowback was awful. I could not believe how mean and judgmental and cruel people were about it, and also the ways in which they weaponized it. And so, I think those experiences, medical school, and then transitioning into residency in particular, by the time I got to residency, I had learned my lesson. And there are reporting requirements, and so there's a way in which you are conditioned to hide it, but then forced to reveal it, and you don't really ever know what you're going to get. And so that was my experience through training and then early parts of professionalization. And this fear of providers not being competent or capable. I had more than a few experiences where people in positions of power said, "Are you kidding? You're the most responsible person here," and so for me, I think there was such a sense of duty that that was one way in which that experience served my practice as a healer. In any case, it felt hypocritical after some point to be preaching this to people, to be writing about it. I don't think there's nothing. I wasn't being hypocritical, nor was I being deceptive, but it felt more authentic and aligned to free myself. And I think also I very much realized that liberating myself would liberate other people, that if I could stand up as a doctor, as a psychiatrist, and say this and not worry about what people thought, that could be freeing for other people. But sure, when you go public with your mental health history, you worry about all sorts of things related to what your colleagues will say, litigation risks, like talking about, managing suicide, all these fears and that we have, real and imagined. So there's a lot that went into it. I think I'm studying myself more and more, but I'll be honest, like it's scary and activating for me to think about it, and also, important and clear what the imperative was.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. I can relate so much to what you've just shared. And I think for myself, learning that there are a couple of people who have died by suicide who we've heard quite a bit about in the last couple of years. In particular, Dr. Candia Bailey, who was bullied to death at work. at Lincoln University. I understand that place and the heartache of being targeted by workplace bullying and mobbing is devastating, just absolutely devastating. And we don't talk about it. And I think this is why I wrote this Black Women Toxic Job Suicide Prevention Manual, because like you were saying with this article, knowing that many Black women are not going to call 911 or go to an emergency room, and that there is help available that's community-based, that's safer, and to know that Black women are not alone in this, that while Black women have the highest rate of suicide between 18 and 65 of any group of women in the United States, but that's a statistic that we don't hear about enough because of misogynoir, because of racism and sexism against Black women. And this is a really common experience, especially for people who have worked really hard their entire lives to go through school, to jump through the professional hoops, to get into that position, only to have it taken in a really violent, psychologically violent way. And so this is also why, I've come to a point where I'm realizing I need to speak about this, because we don't hear about the stories of behavioral health providers who have this history, who survive those experiences. And perhaps if we can start sharing a little bit more about what helps us to survive, then we can be creating an environment that's going to be safer for everyone. I'm aware that we're coming towards the end of the hour. I wonder if you might have a few more moments here, or if we need to.
I sure do. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if you could share a little bit about what has helped you then. I mean, you have this incredible career and this, the training, the experiences that you had along the way. I mean, these are top notch. So, but also extremely pressured types of jobs and training. We're talking Harvard here. We're talking like really prestigious and intense at the same time. What helps you? Let me phrase it differently. What advice might you have for other behavioral health providers who are either in school or at different points in their career who have experiences of mental health challenges?
Oh my gosh. I think I wrote this love letter to the graduating medical school class of 2023, warning them about physician suicide. And I think, what I said, which is what I wish I had was like, those of us who are struggling the most are the best and brightest here, not to, but I think the idea being that those of us who are struggling, we are the heart and soul of the endeavor. I didn't realize that my struggle, I thought my struggle meant there was something wrong with me or deficient in me. I didn't realize that my struggle was the basis for my critique and change and transformation of all the things. And so, I can look back now and say, oh my gosh, how powerful that I felt so completely, how awful and toxic these places were. It meant that I wanted no part in it. And I didn't get that back then. I mean, back then I was, I was not the best medical student because I was so allergic to so much of the acculturation and the professionalization. But I think what I really want to say is your struggle, none of it is okay, but you are so healthy in the midst of this toxicity. And I think that I sometimes look back, and even now, and I say this often, there's no redemptive arc. I cannot in good faith encourage people to become doctors. And, it's really hard when families and parents are like, well, can you talk to and no, I can talk to you as a parent about what your kid is going to be put through. And then, think about that. But sometimes I really wish that, I had it within me to just leave and not do any of it and just say I'm worth so much for who I am, not what I do. I deserve. I really wish that younger version of myself had that. And so I also want to say to people, if you leave, you are a badder baddie than I could ever be. yeah, just to say to people, it's incredibly brave to leave.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. Yeah, I feel like turning the stigma on its head is so important. That if you are in a sick system, whether it is a medical training program or a profoundly toxic and unhealthful workplace, and you feel hurt, angry, sad, any of those things, that's the healthy part of you. You talked about it as being allergic, and that is, and so often these institutions will try and turn it on us and say that there's something wrong with us because we're refusing to fit in, we're refusing to pretend like everything's okay, when really people are being treated horribly. And so too often, especially if we're minoritized people, we end up with that race lighting where they're gaslighting us and supercharging it with racist stereotypes and tropes. And too often, especially women of color, are the racist and sexist trope has to do with mental stability and being nice and smiling all the time in an environment that is hurting us. That, we are trained to look at whether or not there's parallel between what a person's saying and how they're saying it. So if you're smiling where you're saying really crazy, horribly cruel things to other people, then to a mental health provider, that's supposed to be an indicator that something might be off. So if you are in an unhealthy environment that's causing harm and you feel hurt, that is a healthful thing. That's not something that should be pathologized. And too often it is in these environments. You talked about in your article about being the surveillance, what happened to you.
Right.
Would you mind sharing a bit about that?
Absolutely. As I was listening to you, I was just thinking through, the litany of racist tropes, and we can talk about Jezebel and Sapphire and Mammy among Black women. We can talk about, the immigrant other, and then I think to your point about women and women of color, it's the claims of insanity, and the claims of insanity among a melanated woman are tried and true, and there is no defense for it whatsoever. And I was thinking about that in relation to the policing that you were asking me about, because the policing insanity makes. And certainly, and I've done posts about this and talked about this, but for any medical student or resident who has any kind of marker of a mental health history, I got pulled into offices all the time. We heard that this happened in this class and what was going on there. And, it's just like, if I emoted, if I had an emotional reaction or was triggered by something and was trying to, get myself through something, pulled into offices. Certainly, opportunities and accolades that I earned, being taken away. We don't think it's a good idea, but I did the whole application. It's due tomorrow and you're taking it away from me. Now, I think and I want to say this for medical students doing psychiatry residency interviews. And I've talked about this, the interviewers who are often heads of departments, presidents of national organizations, trying to really get in there about your health history and your mental health history. I had that happen over and over and over again in programs. And there was a distinct subset of places that did not do that, just like smiled and tell us all about you. They as deliberate as it was to go after it, it was so clear when people were not. And I'm talking kind of like my back against the wall program directors, like really trying to get to the details of what happened. Those are, I mean, I've had other really off the wall things happen when my files ended up, being publicized or shared in ways, showing up in interviews and stuff and being asked certain things where I had no idea where people had gotten the information about my health. Would I call it a mental health history, or would I call it an extended violent racist trope related to the claims of my insanity?
Say that. Yes.
Was she ever unwell? I don't know. What was unwell?
Has this society ever not been crazy making? I mean, that's I really appreciate when people talk about, instead of mental health, oftentimes mental injury. We are
Yeah.
being injured by family systems, school systems, communities, job forces. And if we were to think seriously about how we are being injured by all of these different relationships that we're involved in, then we would have to, as a society, interrogate why we are injuring ourselves so much. Before we logged on here, I was talking a little bit about Dr. Gabor Mate and his son, Daniel Mate's book, The Myth of Normal. What is it? Trauma, Illness, and Recovery in a Toxic Society. And this is the premise of their book, that we are living in a time that requires parents to work so much that they're not able to be available to children who need it the most in early childhood, that attachment. And then we go through an entire life cycle where we're constantly being put around people who are bullying and or psychologically abusive, and we normalize it. We say, oh, that's just business, or, oh, it's just that person. And then when people are hurt by that, we turn around and blame them for being hurt. So what you're describing in this medical program, and having your back against the wall, and clearly having been undermined, that people were sharing files that they never should have had any business, then that very quickly sends the message that this is a mobbing situation. There are multiple people who are working in tandem to undermine you, to sabotage you. And anyone should be able to understand how that's going to cause a great deal of distress. Dr. Candia Bailey, this was part of what happened with her. She had the university president was horrifyingly terrible to her. And so much so that she asked to go on family medical leave, and she had a doctor who signed off on it, the request, and her abusive boss refused to allow her to go on family medical leave. She went to the board of directors, the governing board, and asked them to intercede, and they refused. They said that they don't get involved in personnel matters. He fired her, and then a couple of days later, she died. And so, like, this was completely preventable. And she was this brilliant woman. Her dissertation was talking about Black women in higher education and the institutional betrayals that happen when whether it's a school system or an employer that really has a responsibility towards our safety, not only fails to keep us safe, but then blames us for the injury as well. It is remarkable that any of us get out of this with any level of sanity, frankly. Right. And that you would go on to be so incredibly courageous. Rupi, like, this is why I started off saying, like, you are the dream psychiatrist that we all want to work with, because that experience would turn many people into silence or conformity. And yet that's just intolerable for you. And so you're out here doing this amazing work. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the program that you're running, the fellowship, please.
Oh, yes. With a lot of support from the right people, I eventually realized that whatever I was doing, whatever I came up with in reaction or response to all the things that I'm sharing in my professional life, that it needed to go beyond me doing it. I think when I found myself with some of these scenarios, getting peer colleague supervision on these things is really, really hard, because you're not going to find many other people, doing things the same way. And so I think the fellowship was sort of, do I dare to imagine an alternative to the last 15 years of my professional life? And, do I dare to sit down and kind of, slide by slide, paragraph by paragraph, brick by brick, try to build this out? And, fortunately, I had been doing enough writing, and I think I had connected or reconnected back, or stayed connected enough to who I was to kind of have this imagination of what other things might look like. And so I think it just started with a decision that I was going to create this, even though, I had no idea if I could put it all together. I had no idea if I could convince anyone to enroll in it. I just realized it needed to reach more people, this different way of doing things. By the way, I think something that doesn't get talked about is just how freeing and impactful these things are. I mean, just the ways in which I've seen these ostensibly small things be so hugely impactful for people. I mean, the proof is there. So yeah, that was a year and almost a year ago that at the August of 2023, I decided, okay, let me build this out and put it together. So the fellowship is the core component is these 30 lectures spread across 5 modules, one of which relates to deep historical orientation, really deep diving into the history of racism and white supremacy in the mental health professions. Another one looks at definitions of racism and whiteness, so that you kind of diagnose these things as they're happening. One is answering the call to action and developing some of the core skills related to critical consciousness instead of just memorizing standards and coughing them up for people, really starting to critique these standards and practices. So those are some of the components. And then each lecture has an anti-racist action component at the end, where we go through anti-racist psychoeducation, documentation, and clinical activism strategies. So, one thing that I've heard over and over again from people is just the being able to do something differently or having, action steps is hugely impactful. So there's the 30 lectures that people have access to. And then we also have group discussions. So we'll meet every other week and have a great discussion. We just did the first pilot, and people love having that opportunity. And I think because the lecture has key terms with definitions, and you're getting a common language and you're getting shared frameworks, the dialogues and conversations end up being so much richer. I think one big reason why these things go nowhere or fall apart within many settings or institutions is because there's no shared understanding to build upon or to disagree upon. It's just people get to bring whatever they want, including their own stuff. And then I also offer opportunities to do one-on-one work with me as well. So we did the pilot in the spring with a great group of people. So just had a wonderful experience with them. And then this fall, I'm gearing up, building up the wait list, and we'll do it again in the spring. And so would love people to sign on if they're interested. And hopefully, we'll build upon it in the coming seasons. I'd love to do an anti-racism child mental health fellowship and also do an advanced effort. And this fall, we'll be building out more programming around it, including LinkedIn events. And, my social media postings have picked up too. So would love for folks to stay in touch and be a part of this community.
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, anyone who's able to spend any amount of time with you is really, really fortunate. But to be a student, a learner in the community with you, oh my gosh. And so I'm seeing Bianca is asking, where do we find this? You share a little bit of that.
Yes. So edu.rupileghamd.com, edu.rupileghamd.com.
Outstanding. Thank you. So you've got a wait list coming up, but there are also, you're on other social media. Would you share with us as well the other social media where folks can find you?
Yep. So you can find me on LinkedIn, which I think most folks can access. And then on Instagram and X, my handle is Rupi Legha MD.
Outstanding. Oh my gosh, Rupi, this has been such an honor to chat with you. Yes, Bianca, we will definitely put all of these links in the chat. We will put the link in for Rupi's article, but also that love letter. When I saw the love letter, Rupi, it was one of the most powerful things that I had seen to date from somebody in any kind of medical background. So we'll put that in there. We'll put all of your links. And if there are any final questions from folks, please do let us know in the chat and we can get to them. But without further ado, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to share, Rupi, that you haven't so far?
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your the gift of sharing your story and welcoming me to share mine. And I hope it supports and nurtures other people to feel freer with their own stories too.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who has logged in. Hope you all have a great evening. You know what I'm going to do in case people would like it? I am going to go ahead for a moment and put up a QR code. So if people will pull out their cameras, please. The QR code, if I can get my computer to work here, what it's going to do is it's going to give you, oh, it's not working. Bummer. Oh, wait, maybe it will now. This is for the Black Women Toxic Job Survivor Suicide Prevention Guide that I mentioned before. And the reason why I'm bringing it up is because there are a number of resources, community-based crisis centers, what Rupi was referring to, that are alternatives to ERs. So they are typically just under 24 hours that a person can go and be in a place. You can get a recliner. Some places will have a bed, but it's a calm environment. You're not required to stay. You can leave at any time, but there are oftentimes nurses, psychologists, psychiatrists, psychologists as well, and peer specialists. And I think that's the important piece is like there are people with lived experience who can be there, who know how to help to bring the temperature down a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and bring it on now. So if people have their phone out, let's see if I can pull it up here.
Yay.
Oh, it was there for a second. Let's try it again. Okay. All right. So I'm going to put that in the chat as well. And then there are a variety of no-cost support groups that are online. So there's so many different places to get support from one another. I want a huge shout out to Physicians Anonymous. We're going to be doing an interview in the near future with somebody from Physicians Anonymous, which is an anonymous support for physicians to go and have coaching one-to-one or group coaching, and it's not reportable to licensing boards that require physicians to disclose their mental health diagnoses or any treatment that they receive. But there are also a variety of additional resources in that guide that can be really helpful to survive suicidal crisis and other kinds of psychiatric crisis in community. Gosh, Rupi, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who has logged on. Hope you all have a great evening, and see you next time.